I was called before the alien queen. What she revealed changed everything. Part 1. The Summons. Calvin Hart was not the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room. He was average in height, average in build, and had the sort of face that was easy to forget 5 minutes after meeting him. He wore plain clothes, kept his hair short, and spoke in a calm, steady voice that never rose above what was necessary. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher, and despite ending up as Earth's diplomatic envoy aboard Conclave Spire 7, one of the most important space stations in the known galaxy, he had never quite lost the habit of being quietly, stubbornly ordinary. He had earned his post the slow way. No powerful family connections, no famous name. Just 30 years of careful, honest work. First as a junior interpreter, then as a cultural liaison, then as a senior analyst, until the people above him ran out of reasons not to give him the job. He was 44 years old, had read more books about alien cultures than most professors, and made the best coffee on the entire station using a small hand press he had brought from home. Conclave Spire 7 floated in neutral space between 6 star systems, a place where 47 species conducted their diplomatic business in an enormous structure that looked from the outside like someone had stacked several different cities on top of each other and then forgotten to stop. Inside, it smelled of 100 different atmospheres carefully blended to keep everyone alive and no one fully comfortable. Calvin had lived there for 6 years and had grown used to it. His mornings were routine. He woke at 6, made coffee, read the overnight reports, and was at his desk by 7. On the morning that changed everything, he did all of those things. The reports were ordinary: a trade dispute between the Helvari and the Drath, a scheduling conflict for the second assembly hall, a reminder that the station's gravity regulators on level 9 needed maintenance. Then at 7:23, a message arrived that had no sender identification, no conclave routing code, and no standard diplomatic header. It had bypassed every layer of the station's communication filters in a way that the system's engineers would spend 3 weeks failing to explain afterward. It appeared simply and quietly in Calvin's personal message terminal, as if it had always been there. It contained 3 words, translated into plain English: "Come, alone, now." Below the words was a set of coordinates and a docking code, and below that, almost as an afterthought, was a seal, a circular mark in deep silver that Calvin had only ever seen in history files. It was the personal seal of the Vorketh matriarchy, not the official diplomatic seal of the Vorketh state, the personal seal, the one used only by the queen herself. Calvin sat with his coffee and looked at the message for a long time. The Vorketh were the oldest civilization in the Galactic Conclave. They had been traveling between stars when humans were still drawing pictures on cave walls. Their homeworld, Athos Prime, was spoken about by other species the way humans used to speak about holy places, with a certain tone in the voice that was equal parts respect and unease. Their queen, Velshara, had ruled for over 1,000 years and was said to have never, in all that time, requested a direct private meeting with a non-Vorketh, not once. He forwarded the message to Lieutenant Nora Webb, his colleague from the Earth Defense Liaison Office, down the hall. She came to his door 4 minutes later, read the message twice, and told him in very direct language that he should not go. "This is not how they do things," she said. She was a practical woman, sharp and experienced, and she was genuinely worried. The Vorketh don't communicate directly with junior envoys. They barely communicate directly with senior ones. This is either a trap or a test, and neither of those is something you should walk into alone. Calvin thanked her for her concern, and asked her to please not report the message to the station commander for 24 hours. She told him that was not something she was willing to agree to. They went back and forth on this for a while. Eventually, and with great reluctance, she agreed to give him 12 hours. He also told his conclave handler, a Drath diplomat named Sival. a tall reptilian figure with gray-green scales and eyes like polished amber, who reacted even more strongly. Sival had worked in conclave diplomacy for 60 years and had always been unflappable. He was very flappable about this. He told Calvin that the Vorkath did not summon people, that the Queen did not speak to outsiders without months of preparation and formal protocol, and that whatever this was, it was deeply irregular and potentially dangerous. Calvin listened to all of this, nodded seriously, and began packing a small bag. He brought no weapons. He had never owned one. He brought a change of clothes, his recorder, a book, and 3 pouches of good coffee. He left a short message for Nora to open only if he had not contacted her within 10 days. Then he walked to the docking bay listed in the coordinates, where a Vorkath vessel was already waiting. It was a long ship, narrow and dark, the color of deep water. The hull had no visible seams. The 6 crew members who stood at its entrance were tall, broad, and armored in silver plate that caught the station lights and scattered them. They did not greet him. They did not explain anything. One of them simply stepped aside, and Calvin walked up the ramp and into the ship. The journey to Athos Prime took 6 days. No one spoke to him for any of those 6 days. Food appeared in his cabin at regular intervals. Plain, nutritionally adequate, and not particularly interesting. He read his book. He made notes on his recorder. Quiet observations about the ship's design, the crew's movements, the quality of the artificial gravity. He slept well, which seemed to unsettle the one Vorkath warrior who passed his open cabin door on the 3rd night and found him peacefully asleep with a book on his chest. On the 6th day, the ship entered orbit above a world that was largely deep blue and silver green, with mountain ranges that were visible from space. They descended through clouds that moved in slow spirals, and Calvin pressed his face to the small porthole like a boy seeing something for the first time. Because whatever else was happening, this was Athos Prime, and it was extraordinary. The palace was older than anything Calvin had ever stood in front of. It rose from a plateau of dark stone and stretched up into the sky in tiered levels of carved white rock, covered in markings that were not decoration, but history. 9,000 years of Vorkath rule written directly into the walls. The main hall inside was half a kilometer long. The ceiling was so high it had its own faint mist near the top. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from something black and dense and faintly luminous, sat Queen Velshara. She was tall, even seated. Her skin was the pale silver blue of old ice. Her eyes were the color of deep space, dark, with faint points of light moving slowly in them. She was wearing no crown, no jewels, nothing ceremonial. She wore simple dark robes and sat completely still, watching him walk the full length of the hall toward her. Calvin walked at a steady pace. He did not hurry. He did not slow down. When he reached a respectful distance, he stopped, looked up at her, and waited. She studied him for a long moment. "You are smaller than I expected," she said. Her English was perfect, with no accent at all, which was somehow more unsettling than an accent would have been. Calvin considered this for a moment. "You are exactly as large as I expected," he said. Something changed in her face. It was small and brief, and it might have been many things, but if Calvin had to name it, standing there in that ancient hall at the end of the longest walk of his life, he would have called it the beginning of a smile. I was called before the alien queen. What she revealed changed everything. Part 2. The Test. They gave him a room that was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth. The ceiling was high and curved. The walls were smooth, pale stone, and a long window looked out over a valley so green and deep that it hurt a little to look at it. There was a bed, a table, a chair, and a shelf that someone had stocked with books, real paper books, in English, which meant that whoever had prepared this room had done it with careful thought. Calvin noticed that. He set his bag down on the table, sat in the chair, and allowed himself exactly 5 minutes of being overwhelmed before he put it away and started being practical again. A Vorketh attendant arrived the next morning, a young female with the same pale silver-blue coloring as the queen, but eyes that were a lighter gray. She was formal and quiet, and spoke English carefully, as if she had learned it recently, and was proud of how far she had come. Her name, as best Calvin could render it, was something like Seva. She brought him breakfast, fruits he didn't recognize, and a grain dish that was warm and faintly sweet, and informed him, in her careful English, that he was a guest of the Queen, and that he should be ready to begin at the 9th hour. Calvin asked, "Begin what?" Seva looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been told not to say more than they've already said. Calvin ate his breakfast. The first thing they brought him to was a long room with 2 raised platforms on either side. On each platform sat 3 Vorketh in robes, not warriors, but older figures with the look of people who had been in important rooms for a very long time. They did not introduce themselves. One of them spoke in Vorketh, and Seva translated. He was told that 2 noble houses were in dispute. The Kethvar house controlled water rights to a river delta that had been shared for 300 years. The Vorshal house relied on that water for agriculture that fed 12 cities. Negotiations had broken down. 3 other mediators had been brought in over the past 2 years, and all 3 had eventually sided with one house or the other, which had ended each attempt. Calvin was asked to try. He spent 40 minutes asking questions. Not about the treaty, not about the water rights. He asked about the river itself, how it had changed over the past century, whether the flow had decreased, whether there had been any changes upstream. He asked about the 12 cities, which crops they grew, whether the crops had changed, how much water they actually needed versus how much they were allocated. He asked about Kethvar's reasons for tightening the rights, not their official reasons, but what pressure they were actually under. The 6 figures on the platforms watched him in silence as Seva translated question after question. Some of the answers required a brief back and forth. Some required someone to leave the room and check a record. Calvin waited patiently each time. At the end of it he said, simply, that the problem was not the treaty. The problem was that the river's flow had decreased by about 14% over 80 years due to upstream glacial changes, and neither house had formally acknowledged this, because doing so would require both of them to accept less than their historic allocation, which was politically painful for both. If they could be brought to that acknowledgement together, simultaneously, so that neither house was seen as giving ground first, a new allocation framework became possible. It would leave both houses somewhat unhappy, but it would be stable, because it would be based on what actually existed rather than what had once existed. He paused, and then added that he would be glad to draft the language for a joint acknowledgement statement if that would help. One of the robed figures wrote something down. Then they were all led out of the room without another word spoken. The second thing was harder. Seva brought him to a smaller room with a single terminal. On the screen was a case file. A human colony ship called the Meridian, carrying 4,012 people, had been quarantined by Conclave Medical Authority 11 weeks ago after a crew member reported symptoms that matched a known biological contaminant. The quarantine had been in effect ever since. The people aboard were healthy. No further cases had developed, but the quarantine had not been lifted. Along with the case file, there was a second document. It was a report, supposedly from a Conclave medical inspector, which contained evidence that the initial symptom report had been misclassified. The evidence in the report, if accurate, would mean the quarantine had no valid basis and should have been lifted weeks ago. Calvin read the case file. Then he read the medical report. Then he read it again, more slowly. He noticed 3 things. The report's document identification number had a formatting style that had been phased out of Conclave records 2 years ago. One of the cited studies in the report referenced a finding that Calvin was fairly sure had been contested in later research. And the inspector whose name was on the report was listed in the conclave directory as currently stationed in a system that was 12 days' travel from where the inspection had supposedly taken place. He sat back and looked at the ceiling. 4,000 people were sitting on a quarantine ship. He had what appeared to be evidence that could free them. The evidence was probably false. Acting on false evidence would set a very bad precedent and might cause a genuine biological safety failure somewhere down the line. Not acting on it meant 4,000 people stayed in quarantine longer. He wrote up a formal notation that the supporting document contained irregularities that required verification before it could be used as the basis for any action, listed all 3 irregularities clearly, and submitted a request for the original inspector to provide a verified statement through current conclave protocols. He noted in the submission that the request was time-sensitive given the humanitarian circumstances, and asked that it be expedited. Then he sat in the room and felt bad about it, because 4,000 people were still on that ship, and there was nothing else honest available to do. The third thing was the strangest. Seva led him to a small courtyard inside the palace, open to the sky, with a stone floor and a small tree growing in the center, whose leaves were a deep copper color. Seva told him to wait. Calvin stood in the courtyard for about 10 minutes, wondering what was supposed to happen, and then a door opened at the far end, and a child came through it. She was Vorketh, young enough that her silver-blue coloring was still uneven, more blue than silver, the way young skin often holds more of the original tone. She was perhaps the equivalent of 6 or 7 in human years. She had clearly been told to come to this courtyard, and just as clearly had not been told there would be a strange short alien standing in the middle of it. She stopped when she saw him, and her eyes went very wide, and she pressed herself against the wall. Calvin looked at her. He understood immediately that this was not a political situation. He sat down on the stone floor, which was cool and a little uncomfortable, and looked away from her, out at the copper tree. After a few minutes, he started talking, not to her exactly, just talking, in the way people sometimes do when they are trying to fill a silence with something harmless. He talked about a dog he had when he was a child, a large, ridiculous creature named Bucket, who had been afraid of rain and had once chased his own tail so enthusiastically that he ran into a fence. He described this in some detail, including the sound the fence had made and the expression on Bucket's face afterward. He heard a small sound. He kept looking at the tree. He talked about the time Bucket had stolen an entire loaf of bread off the kitchen counter and hidden it under the porch, and how they had only found it 3 weeks later, and how Bucket had seemed genuinely embarrassed about it. He described Bucket's embarrassed face with great care. The small sound happened again. This time it was unmistakably a laugh, a small, surprised, quickly swallowed laugh from across the courtyard. Calvin kept his eyes on the copper tree, and smiled to himself. Later, though he did not know this, Queen Velshara sat alone in a viewing room and watched the recording of that courtyard. She watched it through once. On the third viewing, she paused it on the moment when the child laughed, and she sat with that image for a long time before she finally turned the screen off. The next morning, Seva came to his room and told him the Queen would see him. He was brought back to the Great Hall, back down that long half-kilometer walk, back to the throne and the woman on it, who watched him with those deep dark eyes that held moving stars. "You passed," she said. Calvin thought about the quarantined ship, about the child in the courtyard, about the river no one wanted to admit was shrinking. "I wasn't aware it was a test," he said. "That," said the Queen, and now the almost smile was clear, "is precisely why you passed. I was called before the alien Queen. What she revealed changed everything." Part 3. The Revelation. Queen Velshara stood up from her throne. Calvin had not expected that. He had seen recordings of Vorketh formal sessions. They all had. And in every one of them, the Queen was on that throne from the beginning of the session to the end. She did not rise for anyone. She did not move toward anyone. People came to her, stopped at the appropriate distance, and left when dismissed. That was how it had been for 9,000 years, and every species in the conclave knew it. She stood, and she walked down the 3 wide steps from the raised platform, and she crossed the floor toward him. She was very tall up close, nearly a full head taller than him, and she moved with the kind of ease that came not from youth, but from a very long time spent being completely comfortable in a body. She passed him without stopping, and gestured once with her hand, a small backward motion that meant follow, and Calvin followed. She led him through a door behind the throne that he had not noticed before. Behind it was a corridor, and at the end of the corridor was a plain room, not plain in the way of neglect, but plain in the way of deliberate choice. Stone walls, 2 chairs, a table, no windows, 1 lamp, no one else. Velshara said something in Vorketh, and the door sealed. She sat down in one of the chairs. Calvin sat in the other. He noted that the chairs were the same size, which meant someone had anticipated this conversation would involve a human, which meant it had been planned well in advance. For a moment she said nothing. She looked at the table between them, and then she looked at him, and then she said, "I am going to tell you things that no Vorketh has ever told a non-Vorketh being. I have thought about this decision for a very long time. I want you to understand that before I begin." Calvin said, "I understand." She said, "The Galactic Conclave is not what you were told it is." She said it the way someone might say that the sky is not actually blue. Plainly, without drama, just a fact that required readjustment. She told him the truth. The Conclave, humanity had always been taught, was a cooperative body, a gathering of species who had agreed to work together, share resources, settle disputes through dialogue, and build something better than war. This was the story. This was what every human child learned in school and every diplomat was briefed on before taking their post. It was not false, exactly, but it was not complete. For 9,000 years, the Vorketh had not simply been members of the Conclave. They had been its architects, its engineers, and in the quietest and most absolute sense, its managers. Not through force, they had abandoned conquest so long ago that most living Vorketh had never known a war. Through systems, through the careful placement of rules that seemed neutral but were not, through the management of which technologies were shared when, which disputes were resolved, and which were allowed to simmer, which species were elevated to senior status, and which were kept in the comfortable middle tier, where they had enough to be content and not enough to be dangerous. Every species that had ever tried to rise too fast had found, without ever being able to point to exactly why, that things simply did not go the way they should. Initiative stalled, support evaporated, key allies suddenly had other priorities. The Vorketh had spent 9,000 years building a galaxy that was, in their estimation, stable. Not free, not fully, but stable, alive, not burning. Calvin listened to all of this, with his hands folded on the table, and his face very still. Then Velshara said the part that was harder. She said that humanity had been, for 40 years, the subject of a level of conclave management that had no precedent in its history. Not because humans were violent. Not because humans were ambitious. Ambition was manageable. Not because of human weapons or human numbers or human technology, all of which were unremarkable by conclave standards. She said, "We are afraid of how you think." Calvin looked at her. She said it carefully because she wanted him to understand exactly what she meant. Every species the Vorketh had ever encountered, she explained, solved problems in ways that fit within a range. Given a known situation, a known set of pressures, and a known set of resources, the Vorketh could predict with high accuracy the range of solutions any species would produce. Not the exact solution, minds were complex, but the range, the shape of the answer, the general category it would fall into. Humans did not do this. Not because humans were smarter. She was careful to say this clearly, and she said it without condescension. It was simply a data point. Human intelligence by standard conclave measures was solidly average. But human solutions, over and over and over again, across 40 years of observation, fell completely outside the predicted range. Not slightly outside, not in a way that could be attributed to cultural variation or individual outliers. Systematically, reliably, bafflingly outside. Humans made errors that should have ended processes, and the errors turned into solutions. Humans led emotion into logical problems, and the emotion found angles that logic had missed. Humans contradicted themselves mid-process, and the contradiction opened doors. Humans got tired, or frustrated, or fond of something they should have been neutral about, and those very failures produced outcomes that the Vorketh's best modeling systems could not have predicted. The test over the past 3 days had not been to see if Calvin was capable. The Vorketh already knew he was capable. They had reviewed his full history before sending the message. The test had been to see if the pattern held true in direct observation, under controlled conditions, with a Vorketh team watching in real time. It had held. The river solution fell outside the model. The quarantine decision fell outside the model. The thing in the courtyard, the sitting on the floor, the story about the dog, fell so far outside the model that 2 of the 3 observers had initially flagged it as equipment malfunction. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you slowed us down because we scare you?" Velshara did not look away. "Yes." He said, "For 40 years. Yes." He sat with that. Outside the sealed room, in a palace 9,000 years old, a civilization that had managed the galaxy since before his ancestors had learned to read, was waiting to see what one ordinary man from Ohio would do with the most significant piece of information any human had ever been given. Calvin said, "Why are you telling me this now?" Velshara was quiet for the first time since she had started speaking. Not the quiet of someone choosing words, but the quiet of someone who had arrived at the question they had been building toward for a long time. She said, "Because it is no longer working." The management systems that the Vorketh had applied to humanity, the quiet redirections, the stalled initiatives, the carefully managed pace of integration, had been designed for species that stayed within the predicted range. A species that stayed within the range could be guided. A species that fell outside the range did not respond to guidance the way it was supposed to. Over the past several years, the Vorketh had watched humans begin to move in directions that their systems had not accounted for. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the pattern was shifting, and the Vorketh models, which had been reliable for 9,000 years, were beginning to produce results that didn't match what was actually happening. She said, "We built a system to manage something we could not predict. But you cannot manage something you cannot predict. You can only delay it, and delay has a cost." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived on Athos Prime, Calvin saw something in her eyes that was not calculation. It was, he thought, something very close to exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, in this plain room, with its 2 chairs and 1 lamp, put it down. She said, "I would rather face what is coming with a human who knows the truth, standing beside me, than face it alone, with my back to one." Calvin looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He thought about 4,000 people on a quarantine ship, and a child who had laughed at a story about a dog, and 30 years of careful, honest work that had brought him to this room. He looked up at the Queen. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." "I was called before the alien Queen. What she revealed changed everything." Part 4. The Weight of It. Calvin Hart returned to Conclave Spire 7 on a Thursday. He walked off the transport, nodded to the docking bay officer, collected his bag, and went to his quarters. He changed his clothes, made coffee, and sat at his desk. Then he stared at the wall for about 20 minutes while the coffee went cold. Nora Webb knocked on his door at noon. He had sent her a brief message 2 days before his return, just enough to keep her from filing an incident report, but not enough to explain anything. She came in, sat in the chair across from his desk, looked at his face, and said nothing for a moment. She said, "You look like someone explained something to you that you really didn't want to know." Calvin said, "That is fairly accurate." She waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things that made her good at her job. He said, "I can't tell you yet. I will, but I need some time first." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She had known Calvin for 6 years. She had disagreed with him, argued with him, leaned on him during the hard months when the Conclave's posturing over human military access had turned ugly. She trusted his judgment, the way you trust the judgment of someone who has never once been reckless with it. She said, "Okay, but when you're ready, you tell me before you do anything." He agreed. He spent the first week doing nothing differently. He went to his desk at 7, attended the same meetings, filed the same reports, drank coffee in the same corridor with the same colleagues. On the outside, he was exactly the Calvin Hart he had always been. On the inside, he was doing something that felt, in a very human way, like trying to hold a large and complicated piece of machinery in his mind while standing in a small room. He had spent 4 days on Athos Prime after the revelation, talking with Velshara in that plain room at the back of the palace. She had given him access to things no non-Vorkath had ever seen. Not documents. She was not yet ready for documents, but verbal history. 9,000 years of it, selectively but honestly shared. The founding of the Conclave, the early species management frameworks, the decision-making processes behind the elevation and the slowing of specific civilizations. She had answered his questions directly and corrected him when he misunderstood something. By the end of it, he had filled 11 audio files on his recorder, with notes, observations, and the occasional long silence while he processed something difficult. Now he had to decide what to do with it. The obvious thing, the dramatic thing, the thing that would make a good story, would have been to take the recordings directly to the Conclave General Assembly, lay the evidence out, and let the resulting chaos be humanity's revolution. Calvin thought about this option for approximately 1 afternoon, and then set it aside. It had several problems. The first was that he had no documents, only his word. The second was that a galaxy-wide political upheaval caused by a single human envoy acting unilaterally was likely to be messy in ways that would hurt people, including humans. The third, and most important, was that it was the predicted response. It was what you were supposed to do when you found out you'd been managed. You reacted. You pushed back hard and fast and publicly. He was fairly sure the Vorkath had contingency plans for exactly that kind of response. He needed to do something outside the model. He was apparently good at that. He started quietly the way he did everything. He began going through 40 years of human diplomatic history, not the official summaries, which he had read dozens of times, but the raw records, proposals, session notes, back-channel correspondence, internal reviews. He told the archival system he was doing routine historical research, and it gave him access without question. It took 3 weeks, working in the evenings after his regular duties were done. He made no notes that could be found, and kept everything in his head. What he found was not a simple picture of suppression. It was messier than that, and in some ways, more honest. Some of the blocked human initiatives had genuinely been blocked by the Vorkath, redirected through their management systems in ways that looked like bureaucratic delay but were deliberate. But some of the failures had simply been human mistakes, bad timing, poorly written proposals, initiatives that had made enemies unnecessarily. The Vorkath had not manufactured every setback. They hadn't needed to. They had only needed to ensure that the path of least resistance always led away from the places they didn't want humanity to reach. Calvin found this, in a strange way, both worse and more workable than as it had all been manufactured. It meant humanity hadn't been helpless. It meant there were real things that could be done differently, not just systems to tear down. He started to think about who else he needed. He thought about Dana Cole first. She was an envoy stationed on Conclave Spire 12, 3 systems over, and she had filed a formal inquiry 8 months ago about inconsistencies in the Conclave's technology cooperation framework. Specifically, why a request submitted by the human science delegation for access to certain propulsion research had been redirected 4 times through different committees without any of them producing a decision. Her inquiry was currently listed as under review, which in conclave language meant it had been placed somewhere quiet. He reached out to her through an encrypted personal channel rather than official diplomatic comms. He framed it as a professional courtesy, one envoy to another, asking if she'd be willing to compare notes on some regulatory patterns he'd been researching. She replied within a day, with the kind of directness that told him she'd been waiting for someone to ask. They spoke for 2 hours. He told her more than he had planned to, because it became clear within the first 15 minutes that she had already put together a significant portion of the picture on her own. She was sharp, methodical, and had a contained anger about the whole thing that she kept very well managed. She said, "So it's real." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are we doing about it?" He told her he was still working on that, and asked for her patience. She gave it to him, but he could tell it cost her something. Next was Pete Allard. Pete was not a diplomat. He was a xenobiologist who had spent 15 years doing field research for the Conclave's Scientific Cooperation Program, and over that time he had developed a persistent and well-documented concern that the materials humanity was being given access to under the cooperation agreements were consistently the least useful portions of what was available. Not falsified materials, not useless materials, just always, somehow, the second tier. The useful findings always seemed to be in the section that wasn't quite ready to share yet. Pete was cheerful, in the way of someone who had decided that being unhappy about something he couldn't change yet was a waste of energy. He listened to Calvin, asked very precise questions, and then said, "I've had a folder of this stuff sitting on my personal drive for 6 years, waiting for someone to explain what I was looking at." He paused. "Can I send it to you?" Calvin said yes. The last person he needed was Lou Garrison. Lou was 63, retired from the Earth Defense Directorate, after a long career in the Joint Military Cooperation Program with the Conclave, and was currently writing a book that he said was about tactical history, but which was, Calvin suspected, mostly about everything Lou had spent 20 years suspecting and never been able to prove. He lived on a station, at the edge of the Conclave's operational zone, and answered his messages at odd hours. Lou's response to what Calvin told him was the quietest of the 4. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then he said, "I knew the cooperation agreements were wrong. I could never get anyone to see the shape of it." Calvin said, "I can see the shape of it now." Lou said, "What are you building?" Calvin thought about the plain room at the back of a 9,000-year-old palace. He thought about a queen who had stood up from her throne for the first time in recorded history and walked toward an ordinary man from Ohio. He thought about what she had said, that she wanted someone who knew the truth standing beside her, not at her back. He said, "Something they won't see coming." Lou was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm in." By the end of the 2nd month, the 4 of them had a shared picture that none of them had been able to see alone. It was not a perfect picture. There were gaps. There were things Calvin still didn't know and might never know, but it was enough to work with. They began to plan, not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that looked like planning at all. Just 4 humans across 3 different stations, occasionally exchanging careful, professionally worded messages about research projects and cooperative frameworks and the history of conclave procedural rules. And underneath all of it, quietly, patiently, building something that had no name yet, but was beginning to have a shape. Back in the plane room on Athos Prime, Queen Vel-Shara received a brief encrypted message with no header and no identification. It contained one sentence: "We are working on it." She read it twice, then she set it down and looked out the window of the palace at a valley that was green and ancient and still, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was waiting to be surprised. I was called before the alien queen. What she revealed changed everything. Part 5. What changes everything? 6 months after Calvin Hart returned from Athos Prime, he stood in the main assembly chamber of the Galactic Conclave and waited for 31 species to stop talking. The chamber was enormous. It had been designed that way intentionally, to make every individual in it feel small by comparison to the institution. The ceiling was a dome of transparent composite material that looked out into open space, so that during any session you could look up and see the stars, which was presumably meant to remind everyone of the grand scale of the enterprise they were part of. It mostly just made the room cold. The seating curved in wide tiers around a central floor, each section bearing the colors and insignia of a different member species. The Vorketh section was at the highest tier, which had always been described as a structural feature and had nothing to do with hierarchy. Calvin stood on the central floor with a datapad under his arm and waited. He had not planned to be here 6 months ago. He had not planned to be here 3 months ago. The plan had evolved the way most genuinely useful plans do, slowly, by listening more than talking, by letting the shape of the possible dictate the shape of the approach. What had started with 4 people comparing notes had quietly become something more. Not larger in numbers, the core group had stayed small, because small groups could move without making noise, but deeper in preparation. Dana Cole had spent 3 months building a policy framework so thorough and so carefully cross-referenced with conclave procedural law that it was essentially unassailable on technical grounds. Pete Allard had contributed 2 years' worth of documented data on the Technology Cooperation Program that provided the factual foundation for every key claim. Lou Garrison had spent 40 years accumulating an expert's knowledge of the Conclave's military cooperation agreements and what they actually permitted versus what had been implemented. And he had summarized it in language so clear that even someone unfamiliar with the subject could follow every step of the argument. Calvin had done the part that was his to do. He had talked to people, not bargained with them, not offered anything. He had simply, over the course of 6 months, found reasons to have conversations. A shared meal with the Helvari delegation during a break in a trade session. A long walk through the station's observation ring with the Sari representative, who was famously difficult and had been considered an automatic opposition vote by every human delegation for 30 years, but who it turned out had extremely strong opinions about terrestrial plant biology that Calvin found genuinely interesting. A late evening in the station's common room with 3 members of the Draft Cultural Exchange Program who wanted to understand human music and spent 2 hours listening to Calvin describe the concept of a song being sad and joyful at the same time, which they found philosophically fascinating. He had not asked any of them for anything during any of these conversations. He had just been present and curious and honest and occasionally funny in a way that translated across species lines better than most people expected it to. By the time he filed the procedural request to address the full assembly, 17 member species had already seconded it before the Vorketh block had time to register an objection. 3 more seconded it in the first hour after filing, apparently because they had heard about it from other delegations and didn't want to be left out of something that seemed significant. By the time the session was formally opened, Calvin had the floor whether anyone was fully comfortable with it or not. He had invoked a procedural clause that technically permitted any member's representative to address the full assembly on matters of structural conclave policy. The clause had been written into the original conclave charter 9,000 years ago and had been used 3 times in recorded history. It required 20 member species to second the request. No one had ever come close to that number before. The presiding officer, a Kethyar named Oval, who had chaired sessions for 40 years and had the expression of someone who had seen everything and was deeply tired of it, read the request, looked at the number of seconding signatures, looked at Calvin, and said in a tone of perfect professional neutrality, "The floor is recognized." Calvin said thank you, and began. He did not talk about 9,000 years of managed history. He did not name the Vorkath. He did not use words like suppression or control or conspiracy, because those words would have divided the room before he had said anything useful. He talked about water. Specifically, he talked about the way the Conclave's technology and resource cooperation framework had, over time, developed a structural pattern that consistently resulted in the least efficient allocation of shared resources. He talked about it the way Pete had taught him to, with data, specific and documented, presented without drama. He showed 3 case studies in which cooperative resource agreements had produced outcomes that were measurably worse than the models had projected, and identified the specific procedural bottlenecks responsible. He showed 12 years of technology access requests from multiple species, not just humans, that had been redirected through committee structures in ways that added an average of 4 years to the access timeline without producing any corresponding benefit in safety or review quality. He was careful to include examples from 9 different species, not just humanity. This mattered. Then he tabled the proposal. It was a restructuring of the cooperative framework, a new set of procedures for technology and resource sharing that removed 4 specific bottleneck committees, replaced them with a streamlined review body with fixed timelines, and established a transparent appeals mechanism for cases where access was delayed. It was co-authored by Dana, Pete, and Lou, and it was written in the specific, precise language of conclave procedural law that made it very hard to oppose on technical grounds, without appearing to argue in favor of inefficiency. It was not a revolution, it was a policy document. But it was a policy document that, if passed, would remove 4 of the 7 primary tools the Vorkath had used for decades to manage the pace of other species development. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours. Several delegations spoke in favor. 2 spoke against, raising concerns that were procedurally valid, and which Calvin's framework had already accounted for. Dana had anticipated both objections and built responses into the original draft. The Vorkath delegation did not speak at all, which was noticed by everyone in the room. At the end of the 3 hours, the presiding officer called the vote. It passed. Not unanimously. 31 in favor, 9 opposed, 7 abstaining, but binding. In the Vorkath gallery, far above the chamber floor, Queen Velshara sat in a viewing seat that was separate from the formal delegation box, with no attendance, and watched. She had come personally, which none of her staff had understood, and none of them had felt comfortable questioning. She watched Calvin receive the result with the same calm, steady expression he had worn for the entire session. She watched him thank the presiding officer. She watched him gather his datapad. She watched him walk off the central floor at the same unhurried pace he had walked onto it. Nora Webb was waiting at the side corridor. She fell into step beside him, and they walked in silence for a moment. And then she said, "Well." Calvin said, "Well." She said, "You're going to tell me everything now, aren't you?" He said, "Yes, over coffee, the good kind." She said, "I want to be angry at you for keeping me out of this for 6 months." He said, "That's fair." She thought about it and said, "I'll be angry tomorrow. Today, I'll just be glad it worked." Back in the assembly chamber, the session was breaking up. Delegations were filing out, discussing the vote in the particular way that diplomatic people discuss things they didn't entirely see coming, with careful language and lots of thoughtful pauses. The sorry representative, making his way toward the exit, caught Calvin's eye across the room and gave him a small, acknowledging nod. Calvin nodded back. In the corridor outside the Vorkath gallery, a senior envoy named Velorath, one of the Queen's senior staff, a figure Calvin had never been formally introduced to, stepped into his path as he and Nora were passing. She held out a small sealed message, looked at him for exactly 1 second, and then stepped back into the corridor and was gone. Calvin put the message in his pocket and waited until he was alone in his quarters that evening to open it. The seal was the same one that had started all of this, the personal seal, the one used only by the Queen. Inside was a single sheet, and on it was a short message, handwritten in Vorketh script, with a human translation written carefully below each line. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. It said, "You thought wrong again. It worked again. We need to talk about what comes next." He folded the sheet very carefully and held it in his hand for a moment. Outside his porthole, the stars were doing what they always did, shining steadily across enormous distances, indifferent to the small, complicated things happening in the dark between them. Calvin Hart, an ordinary man from rural Ohio who made good coffee and had once had a dog named Bucket, put the message in the inside pocket of his jacket, very close to where he kept the things that mattered. He sat down, poured himself a cup, and began thinking about what came next. Back on Earth, no news channel led with the story. It ran as a brief item on the Diplomatic Affairs segment, a procedural update from the Conclave, a cooperative framework revision. Nothing that would make most people look up from their morning routines. The kind of thing that happened in the background of history while everyone was looking somewhere else. But in the quiet offices of 31 species, who had watched the Conclave operate for a very long time, something was understood that had no official language yet. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way of wars or speeches or grand declarations. In the way of water, finding a new path through old stone. The shape of the galaxy had shifted, and it had done so because one very human man had sat on the floor of an alien palace, told a story about a dog to a frightened child, and made her laugh. And a queen who had ruled for 1,000 years had decided for the first time in her long, long life to bet everything on something she couldn't predict. It was not the end of anything. It was, in the quiet and certain way of all real beginnings, a start.